Have you ever been denied your rights? What should you do if your rights have been denied? How do you know what your rights are? Is defending rights reserved only for rich people? Suppose you're waiting trial for killing 13 people. Do you have a right not to shave? Our guest today is Jim Harrington, who started the Texas Civil Rights Project over 20 years ago to provide legal assistance and education without cost to poor and low-income families, particularly minority persons, to advocate for racial, social, economic equality in Texas through education and litigation. Jim is the director for the Texas Civil Rights Project. We're happy to have him here with us to help explore some of the difficult civil rights issues we face. Stay with us. You're watching Access News, hands-on news. Thank you, Jim, for being here with us today on Access News.
My pleasure. I'm glad to be here.
Before we get started, I want to ask you a little bit about why you decided to set up a civil rights organization.
Well, Texas, I think, was in great need of a civil rights organization, and we have all kinds of problems in Texas, and it was important, I think, to establish a nonprofit organization that we could get funding from foundations and establish a project. We now have 5 offices around Texas, and we do all kinds of different civil rights work.
You mentioned that Texas has a lot of problems. Can you name a few?
Well, the list is long in Texas, but you can start anywhere you want. We have, of course, all kinds of discrimination against people, against women, against minority folks, against people with disabilities. We have voting rights issues, of course, in Texas, very severe voting rights issues. We have the whole immigration question and trying to suppress vote in the Hispanic community. And I think virtually any civil rights problem that you can think of, we have going on here in Texas.
I don't know if that's a good thing. One of your lawsuits that I'm particularly interested in, Esther Valdez. Does that ring a bell?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. She's a deaf individual, and she was arrested for resisting arrest after an officer called her on the street and she didn't turn to look. And that would happen in 2009. The suit was against the Austin Police Department. Can you tell us a little bit about the outcome of that lawsuit?
Yeah, actually, this is the second time we had to sue Austin Police Department over its policy, or non-policy, I guess you'd say. The first time was with an elderly couple at a restaurant who were trying to order, and the clerk misunderstood, and the police came, and because the police couldn't communicate, they arrested the gentleman and took him to the jail. Fortunately, the jail said, we're not going to accept him, and they let him go. But as a result of that, we had filed a suit against APD, and got a policy about calling interpreters to the place where the police are involved in the situation. Well, here you have a couple walking down the street, 2 women walking down the street, doing ASL, and the police misinterpret that as a fight, and then appear on the scene, and then it gets worse and worse and worse, even though the policy of the police department is to call an interpreter. And they have an interpreter either at the office or on call, theoretically. But this case manifested the fact that they didn't follow their policy. And so we sued them again. And hopefully this time they will pay better attention so that we won't have this stuff going on in the future.
So are there any new changes that came from that lawsuit that the department, anything the department will be doing differently? What were the changes that we might see?
Well, the big change hopefully is going to be a more intensive training of the officers, not only in the academy when they're preparing to be officers, but also on the job training. And there's a shift training that goes on when they switch shifts, that they have a period of training. So hopefully they'll get the point and do the training. And then there's also a citizens group, a disability group that meets to see what the progress is. And sometimes it seems to go all right, and sometimes it doesn't. And part of the problem, I think, is the culture of the police officer, who feels that challenged when someone speaks back or doesn't respect the authority of the officer in the way the cop wants to be respected. So sometimes I think you have that kind of clash, not just, and it's made worse by the disability situation. We have another case that we're litigating that's even more difficult, and this was a deaf woman who arranged to date a deaf gentleman, and he ended up raping her. And but he called the cops to get her evicted from his apartment. So the officer gets there and cannot communicate, does not call an interpreter, tries to write a note, get her to communicate notes. Well, she doesn't know English well enough to write notes, so he arrests her, and she's in jail for 3 days. And finally, some guard walks by in the jail who knows enough ASL that can communicate a little bit, and eventually gets her out. So we have that case going on. The problem is we're having a very difficult time with the federal judge getting him to understand that ASL is a language, that note-taking by an officer is not necessarily a reasonable accommodation. And it's unfortunate because you have a very good law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, but sometimes even the judges don't understand what it means, particularly in the deaf culture, in the idea that ASL is a separate language. It expresses a different conceptual framework. And, just he doesn't understand why does notes work? Why can't you just write a note? And the thing is, here's a woman who claims that, and she requested an interpreter so that she could talk to the officer, right? Because she had been raped.
So what happened?
Well, we still have the case.
Why didn't an interpreter come?
The officer wouldn't do it. He got mad. This is that thing again about challenging the authority.
The power struggle, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Seems that your office doesn't only handle lawsuits, but also education and advocacy for minority groups, correct?
Yes, very much. We have actually, and we make great use of volunteers. We have, in fact, in one of our volunteer groups, we run what's called a Safe Schools program. And these are young kids, by my standards, who are in college, and they go into high schools and junior highs and work with classes on issues of bullying and diversity and acceptance and all that kind of stuff to create a safer environment in the schools. And it's a very good program and very important. But that's kind of stuff that we do, in that context with volunteers. We also do a lot of human rights reports, where we report on stuff that's going on and different issues, hate crimes, for example, access to courthouses for folks with disabilities, a whole number of issues. So we try to, we have 5 offices, we have 34 staff, but we try to involve as many volunteers from the community because that expands our work, gets people committed to civil rights, and hopefully will have a benefit to the community.
Seems to me that sometimes the litigation is necessary for change to happen. But why is that? Is there any way that we can avoid lawsuits from having happen?
No, I think it's the nature. It's part of our nature as human beings that we have to have coercion to change our behavior, and law has been recognized since the beginning of, I guess, our self-organization as human beings. It's very highly respected, and I reflect back on the civil rights movement, how that movement went for 100 years trying to integrate voluntarily, essentially, right? But you had to actually pass the law. to change behavior. Changing behavior, of course, changes the way people think. And when you look at young kids now in high school and in college, their whole acceptance of diversity in this country is remarkably different than what their parents, and even more dramatically different than what their grandparents had. And so it's important to do.
Jim, as you know, we do a small segment called the Presidential Fun Facts. So let's go ahead and watch Alon and his comments now.
The United States' first president, George Washington, is the only president to be unanimously elected. He also earned the distinction of refusing to accept his presidential salary of $25,000 per year. Another interesting fact is that he never lived in the present-day White House. During Washington's presidential terms, the United States Capitol was located in Philadelphia and other cities. Perhaps most interesting of all is that George Washington is the only president who did not represent a political party. James Madison is known as the father of the Constitution. He is also known as the shortest president of the United States thus far, standing at only 5 feet 4 inches and weighing less than 100 pounds. Herbert Hoover was an orphan whose first job was picking bugs off potato plants, for which he was paid $1 per 100 bugs. He was also a mine worker. By the time he got to the White House, he was a wealthy man. Herbert Hoover donated his entire presidential salary of $75,000 per year to charity. Today, the president's salary is $400,000 per year. Ulysses S. Grant helped set up Yellowstone National Park, our country's first national park. Perhaps not so well known is that he was the first president to run against a woman. The 1872 nominee of the Equal Rights Party, Victoria Woodhull. Woodrow Wilson did not learn the alphabet until 9 years old and could not read until age 12. Yet he became president of Princeton University and later, President of the United States. One interesting tidbit is that Wilson was the first to show a controversial motion picture in the White House, The Birth of a Nation. At 6 feet 4 inches, Abraham Lincoln was the tallest president. As a young man, Lincoln ventured into business and was a licensed bartender and co-owner of Berry & Lincoln, a saloon in Springfield, Illinois. Shortly after this venture, Lincoln began his political career. He was the first president to be born outside of the original 13 states, and the first president to die by assassination. He was shot in Washington, D.C. while watching a theatrical play at the Ford Theater.
Thank you, Alon. We're here chatting with Jim Harrington, director of the Texas Civil Rights Project. Let's pick up where we left off. You've been defending rights for many years now. Why do rights need to be defended?
Well, I think it has to do with the basic dignity of the person, and how we structure our communities, and to make sure that the rights of everybody's protected. The individual rights are protected, civil liberties are protected, because we know that protecting rights actually strengthens our community. It fosters individuality. Individuality strengthens community. And I think one of the very ingenious things about the Bill of Rights as a concept has been to help structure the community, bring everybody inside the community, foster their individuality, and treat everybody equally.
Tell me your views on the death penalty.
Well, I think there are two ways to look at it. One is my personal view is I'm opposed to it. I don't think that we have the right to take people's lives. I think it teaches the wrong message to our kids. It teaches revenge and vengeance. But even if you believe in the death penalty, it doesn't work. All of the studies show that it falls disproportionately, of course, on minority folks. That's because they're poor. That's because the quality of legal representation they get is very bad. And we now know through science, through all of the DNA stuff that has gone on in the past few years, that it's unreliable. Even when we have the standard beyond a reasonable doubt, even when we have all the protections built in terms of appeal, it still puts people on death row who aren't guilty of a crime. So I think you can't justify it empirically, and I don't think you can justify it morally.
Earlier in the opening, we talked about how someone may have the right not to shave after killing 13 people and awaiting trial. Now, you know, we're talking about Major Nidal Hassan, who was responsible for the massacre in 2009. Help us understand the process related to the legal process related to the facial hair and whether we have the right to force him to shave.
Okay, that's an interesting question because you have the military justice system that's separate from our general justice system under the Constitution, and the courts do not give as much protection to the military system, to the individuals in the military system, because of principles of uniformity and discipline, that kind of thing. If you were in a civil trial, non-military, you would have the right, without a doubt, to have a beard for religious reasons. In the military, it's a closer call. The courts have said in the past that the military can do whatever they want. Congress then passed a law and said there had to be reasonable accommodation. So, for example, if a religious person, let's say a Sikh, is working in an office, military office, doing clerical stuff, he would be entitled to wear his turban. If he was out in the battlefield, he would not be, because then that would get in the way of the discipline. The question is, can the Army enforce the grooming code that it's trying to enforce right now against Hassan? The judge said no, but it went up on appeal right away. So I think is going to be a question: what is the religious expressive right here, and is the Army wrong to insist on a grooming code for trial? So it's a very interesting question because it shows that you have a different military justice system that is not as protective of individual liberty as opposed to the civil system that we generally operate under, where there is greater protection of religious liberty.
It's really interesting to see that there are different rights depending on where you are, who you work for, and regarding the military, and whether you're in the military or not. Now, how do I know what my rights are for sure? I mean, how do I know what I can and cannot do?
That's a good question. A lot of people ask the same question. We, of course, have a great website, and you can look at that. There are a number of organizations that have websites. The Department of Justice has a website. I think it's also important to encourage parents to encourage their children to pay attention to civics class or government class. It's amazing to me how many people just really have a very hard understanding of how the system works. But what is also amazing to me is that people are only interested in protecting themselves, and they don't understand that protecting everybody's rights helps them protect their own rights. Because anytime you have an exception and you give the government more power, then the government's going to take power against everybody. There are a lot of people who will call me up and say, you know, I was fired because of this. And I said, well, you know, 5 years ago, the employer, that would have been illegal for the employer. But since then, the courts have changed. And now it's legal for the employer to discriminate in that fashion. And they said, well, how can that be? So the next question I ask, did you vote? And inevitably, the answer is no. You know? And that's a very serious problem in American democracy, is that we don't participate in the way that we do, and we don't understand very well that we have to protect the rights of everybody in order to protect the rights of ourselves.
Where's the best place to start in doing that? I mean, I'm sure our audience is probably thinking, you know, there's so many things out there, so much information, it becomes overwhelming. What's your advice for them?
Well, I think, you know, I think generally people have an instinct about what is violating their rights. Of course, they get a lot of education from TV, which is not always correct. And I don't think that it is super complicated. For example, let's just, in terms of disability law, for example, that we do a lot of, the Department of Justice has an excellent website, just terrific, about, in a very simple way, questions that people ask, and and then they have the responses written out. So, and there are a lot of that, a lot of those, in the age of the web, there are a lot of websites that are out there, and you can find a lot of stuff by Googling. I'm a lawyer, but I don't know all the answers, and I find a lot of stuff by Googling. So it's important to take advantage of that. But I think quite often people instinctively understand that there's something wrong. They may not understand exactly what the legal theory is, but they recognize that there's some violation of principle or dignity or equality going on.
Talking about rights and a little bit about the death penalty, and we're going to touch on those in this next question. Unalienable rights. So the Declaration of Independence says that we have unalienable rights: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. So now when we talk about the death penalty, is that taking away an unalienable right? I mean, how is it unalienable if it can be taken away?
Well, that's a very good question. And I think that's what a lot of the argument would be on by people who oppose the death penalty. The problem is a court would say, first of all, we have to understand the Declaration of Independence wasn't designed for everybody, right? It was designed for the white male landowners of the colonies. The person who really changed the way we think about equality and rights was Abraham Lincoln. He actually introduced the way that we think about it now in his speeches and his rhetoric. The other problem is the court says, well, you know, when we talk about life, liberty, pursuit of happiness being inalienable, we look at what was the practice at the time. And there was death penalty at that time. In fact, there was torture and maiming and all kinds of stuff that was legitimate in the colonies, even after we became independent. So the court would say, well, you know, that's obviously defines what we mean by life. I'll tell you the other interesting thing that we don't talk about in the inalienable right is the fourth part of that: life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and the duty of government to protect and preserve those rights. That's at the end of that paragraph. You know, quite often we look at this as totally as an individual mandate to protect our individual rights, but actually the document has this communitarian aspect to it, that this is a society thing, and that the society is there to protect those rights, not only to enjoy them, but to protect them for everybody.
Rights are often like for instance, no, go ahead. Long ago, back when women couldn't vote, and then obviously they fought for that right and now can vote. But we talk about rights versus non-rights. When a right is added or taken away, does it mean it was a privilege versus a right? And what's the difference between right and privileges?
Well, a right is something that we would say is inherent in somebody because they're a human being, right? That I am a human being, therefore I have a right to liberty. I have the right to pursue happiness. A privilege is something the government grants you. I think your idea of women voting is very good, because men at the time of female suffrage would say this is a privilege we're giving to women. God help you if you take that position these days, right? I mean, we would say that you can't discriminate in the suffrage because of sex. I mean, so our ideas evolved, that it's a right. And I think it's important to understand, and we don't do this very well as Americans either, is that the Bill of Rights that we have since 1789 should not be the last word. You know, that our idea of rights evolves. The great thing about the American experiment was this was the first time that the Bill of Rights was written down. What every other country has done since then is to take a Bill of Rights and expand it and develop it. South Africa, for example, has one of the best Bill of Rights currently, you know, and we need to understand that what rights were in 1789 are different than what rights ought to be in 2013. For example, the right of health care. You know, the debate in our society right now, is this a privilege or a right? You know, that's going on. And we sort of shut down on that argument, that we don't want to face it because we don't want the consequences of it. If it is a right, then we got to do a better job of protecting it for the community.
Thank you for explaining the difference there. And thank you for being with us today on Access News. We really enjoyed the conversation today.
My pleasure.
You may learn more about the work of Professor Harrington by visiting the Texas Civil Rights Project website and at our website, accessnews.us, where you may ask questions and share your comments and opinions. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. One beautiful thing about America is that we, the people, have power. The more we know, the better decisions we can make. For Access News, I'm Tamara, and that's Austin. Thank you.
Created, written, and executive produced by Devorah Ben-Moshe and Ken Hurley. Hosted by Tamara suiter-ocuto. Interpreter for Tamara suiter-ocuto, Jennifer Stoker. Segment host for A More Perfect Union, Elon Ben-Moshe. Special thanks to Texas School for the Deaf. Funding provided by the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. Supported by Austin Community Foundation. Production by Austin Community College. Civication Incorporated, www.civication.org.